I'd like to welcome you to the next in the Work From Home Better interview series. I'm productivity catalyst Clare Kumar, and I'm very excited to have with us today Lindsay Lapaquette. She was formerly a speech pathologist and became a leadership communications expert. So communications expert for the workplace. If you're looking for someone with those skills, with a background not only in speech pathology, but she's worked with clients with social interaction challenges. I'd love to know what that means. Profoundly influenced by work with First Nations communities. And Lindsay, you shared that you parent two children with what you call pervasive mental health challenges. And all of this informs the work that you do to help leaders communicate better. So I want to welcome you today. I'm thrilled to have you with us.
Well, thank you, Claire. I'm really excited to be here with you.
So let's dive right in. I sense that communication is different now with many of us working from home. Some people may be used to it. You may have led remote teams before, but a lot of leaders are in a new position where they might not have been having to think about communication differently. So is there something you can kick us off with, what are the top things to think about as a leader as to what's different now and what you might need to bring to the table differently?
Yeah. So I think rather than things being different, I think the current circumstances are heightening pre-existing challenges with communication. That's my opinion. And so I think teams that were struggling to communicate effectively and really to connect with one another, that gap has become wider now that people are at home. And so I think more than ever, we have to be really conscious about making sure that as leaders that we're communicating with our teams in ways that make them feel heard. And I'd say that was true before. But now if your team's at home, that's a lot trickier than it was before.
Yeah, because we've removed some media. We've removed the in-person communication vehicle, which was there, which gave us so much richer information when we're communicating. So now we have to figure out how are we going to accomplish all of these same needs, which to your point, I agree with. I look at this situation as a pressure, which is showing where the cracks were. And in a lot of things, whether it was time pressure or relationship pressure, financial pressure, there are a lot of things that are heightened, as you say, heightened. So with the opportunity then to need to stay communicating in a really rich way, where do you start as a leader as saying, okay, I've got a bigger challenge here. What do I do?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest challenges that I see teams facing right now is that the needs of each individual person on a team can be drastically different because if they're working from home, their home situation may be entirely different from their colleagues. So you may have anything from, an employee who absolutely loves to be working from home and wants to do this for the rest of their life and is highly productive at home.
That'd be me.
Right. And that's me also. Or you may have someone with 6 children at home. I spoke with somebody who had 5 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment and both spouses were working from home. And the kids were fairly young. I don't remember the ages, but they were, maybe 10 and under. And that is an entirely different situation.
Yeah.
So I think one of the best things a leader can do is to have one-on-one conversations with their employees and find out what are the challenges they're facing, what works well for them, where are their challenges? Because I think, we've often taken a one-size-fits-all approach to what employees are allowed to do, the hours they're supposed to work. And I find that when companies are taking that approach now, it's placing so much stress on employees who are in situations that the solution being proposed just doesn't fit their current life at home. So I think having those conversations is one of the biggest keys to being able to successfully navigate what everyone needs to be able to be productive.
I would say it's always been potentially difficult for people, but now because work has landed in our living rooms, we have a better appreciation of people, or at least a bigger slice of their life has been, communicated with us. And we can't fail to notice that. And so it was always there. So I look at this, I'm hoping there's a big, what I call a compassion crack happening too, where there's an opportunity to step into this place of empathy and compassion as a leadership to dive into trying to understand those challenges. So I love that. So this may be quite foreign for leaders who haven't been thinking that this is part of the work experience. You're supposed to do this job. You're very task focused. I want you to just complete that. I don't need to worry about anything else to do with you as a human being. I just here's task A, B, and C, and just talk to me about that. So how do we navigate this if we're not used to having these open, safe conversations? What does that look like?
Yeah. And listen, I think the people you're describing, I think, are the leaders who are having the most challenge with this. And it's not so much that they don't care about their team. It's that their focus is task over people. And to be honest, that is my natural inclination. So when I'm really busy and really stressed, I'm more inclined to finish what I have to do for work before going out to coffee with friends, back when we could go for coffee. And so it's not that they don't care about their team, but learning to shift that focus to people first was also something I had to learn to do. And what I realized over time was that for people who are task focused like myself, that approach works okay. For the ones who need personal connection to be able to feel heard and focus and get their work done, what happens is when we're not doing that is it's just this huge disconnect. And so I think as a leader, admitting it is one of the first things. I think as an employee, I would have loved to have some of my past bosses say to me, listen, I'm having a hard time with this adjustment. I am trying to adjust to understanding your reality. Please know that I'm working on this, and I'd like you to join me on that journey, is a big first step. And it may be too big of a step for some people who are really uncomfortable. So finding that baby step of how can I connect with my team? So for somebody who feels highly uncomfortable having these more real, vulnerable conversations, it may be something just such as every time you speak with your team member, you leave 2-3 minutes at the beginning of the conversation to ask them how they're doing. And you restrain that impulse to shift the conversation towards how is work going. And you just listen to how is that person doing in their situation. And your role there is not to fix it. It's not to give them advice. It's just to listen and reflect back and say, it sounds like things are tough. And that's a big first step that I think a lot of people really appreciate.
Okay, so what happens? Because how are you doing is a trigger question for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I remember after my dad died, somebody said, how are you doing? And that was an unleash the whole of everything that I was carrying and holding in. What happens when that happens?
Yeah. So I think that's actually what holds people back from asking sometimes is, and I see that in myself, so both what you said in that, for me, it makes me open up and unleash everything. And then I think it makes people uncomfortable with wanting to ask. And so I've also had to learn how to put boundaries around when somebody is getting into more than I can handle. And so I think it's okay as a leader to say, for instance, set up the circumstance to begin with and say, maybe we have 2 or 3 minutes. I just want to speak about, what kind of challenges you're experiencing at home. And so kind of set the boundaries maybe a little tighter, you're right, than just how are you doing, about how long you have, what piece of the issue you're looking to address. And in fairness, 2 to 3 minutes is probably not going to cut it. So maybe say 5 minutes. And then at the end of the 5 minutes, say, listen, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate knowing that. We'll revisit this later on. So knowing how to rein that conversation back in is a really important skill. And I think without that, it makes people afraid to get into those conversations because then you're stuck and you can't get out sometimes. And that can feel really overwhelming, I think.
Exactly. That's why I thought, it could be a slippery slope, especially for someone who, might be more towards the emotional and expressive side. Then all of a sudden it's, what do I do? So I agree. Like every meeting should have an agenda, right?
Yeah.
So why not make this a known part of the agenda so it doesn't feel like it's coming out of left field, especially if this is something new. So I love that sentiment of sort of being very open about let's try something here because, loneliness was rampant before COVID hit,
Yes, I agree.
as a real sabotage of productivity and performance. So
Mhm.
if we start to really recognize, even people in offices, I was coaching last year in one of the really young, really funky social media offices downtown. And a lot of people 25 to 30 were like, when we had private one-on-ones, they were like, I'm lonely. I'm
Yeah,
really lonely. I don't know how to connect with my colleagues. And they were in an office.
yeah,
So it wasn't generational. It wasn't, perhaps a little bit cultural. A fair number were new to Canada. So
okay.
there's, like you said, one of the things I really hope comes out of this whole opportunity is looking at individual work experiences. We talk about
Mhm.
customer experiences and the user experience. I think we really need to recognize that if we're engaging people's brains, as many of the jobs in the world are, right? We're looking for deep thinking, creative thinking. What if we expand the experience around work to really fit the individual as much as possible, and have a conversation right out of the gate as to say, what the words I use are, what do you need to succeed?
Yes,
What
yes,
do you need? So yeah,
I
it gets a little
agree.
positive.
I
Yeah.
agree. And I think too, just to get back to your point about those conversations that can just be fully open and relating it to the need to succeed, I think where we want to be careful is those conversations that are really quite toxic, where somebody is complaining, and there's no, um, they're kind of just pushing all of their emotions onto you without wanting to resolve them. And that's, um, it's a little much and it feels very overwhelming. And so I think framing the conversation to begin with around, I'd like to talk about some of the some of the challenges so that we can identify a few steps we can take. So
Yeah.
really setting it up as, we're brainstorming for solutions. It's not a venting session. It's not, you need to be
Yes.
careful as a leader to keep that line between, this isn't therapy and leaders are not qualified therapists. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important, um, to have a framework around how these conversations will go. And I have seen, I've consulted to teams where when the door opens, the floodgates just open to complaining because there is so much pent up
Yes.
resentment.
Yes.
So it's, how do we let those um, challenges and emotions come out, but in a way that is also respectful of the other team members? Because sometimes those conversations, I've seen them move into, disrespecting people around them. And that's where the leader needs to get a tight hold on, for instance, saying, we're not here, uh, you know, I'm not looking, these conversations aren't about how do we blame other team members. I want to talk about the challenges. Let's talk about the behaviors. Let's talk about,
Mm-hmm.
and keep a tight rein on those conversations staying productive. And that's a tough skill.
It is a tough skill. This is triggering for me a conversation I had in probably 1995. I went to a CEO breakfast, and this was an opportunity to ask questions, right? And so most people were asking, what are we doing in Q3? What's our strategy? How are we going to drive revenues, cut costs, whatever? And I said, uh, what do you think about the ergonomics in the office? and and the CEO, actually, he was a really articulate guy, but he just said, I think we're in a great location. And that was his, like, it shut down the conversation. He came to me afterwards in the meeting where there was some mingling time, and he said, could you please take your thoughts to the VP of HR and set up a meeting with her to discuss them? So it was interesting. I thought the takeaway from me was, okay, not the question he was anticipating, didn't really have an answer, but he heard me
Right.
and there was a path forward. So I think the opportunity to say, I hear what you have to say, and we don't have time for it in this meeting, but I do want to
Yes.
hear you. Can we schedule some other time? Please book 30 minutes in my calendar and let's dive into this.
Yeah.
That person will feel heard, have a place for that energy to go. And I redirected somebody at the pool yesterday. Public swimming pools have just opened up in Toronto, and there's some finessing around managing lots of hot people who have been in line for about an hour trying to get in for a half an hour
Right.
swim. So you can imagine tension conversation.
Yeah.
And a few people came up to me and saying, how did your conversation go with the lifeguard? I'm like, I had a great conversation with the lifeguard, and they wanted to complain. And I said, well, I suggest you take that to our 311, our city number, say, and raise that. And the more people that do, the more results we'll get. But I didn't want to be the basket. I call it passing a stress hot potato. I'm like, I don't want all the emotion. Like, I don't have any room to carry that. So I'm hearing you, and this is where I'm going to suggest you take that potato.
Well, and I think you're hitting on an important point in terms of the changes, you know, around COVID and everything going on, is that stress levels are higher. They're exponentially higher is my sense. You know, I'm living in my own little bubble in my house, so I can't fully tell, but the sense I get is that people on average are highly stressed. And when we're stressed, it affects how we communicate with others. We're not going to be as patient. We're not going to listen as well. We're going to, you know, we have a tendency to either shut down or to become overly aggressive and push our viewpoint on someone else. And we have a hard time seeing, you know, the why of the situation. With the lifeguard, for instance, whatever was going on, we lose our patience faster. And so one of the biggest skills, in my opinion, that leaders can work on that helps, you know, communication improve is one that I've really worked on in my life, which is how do I calm myself down first before I engage in this conversation? Or if I'm in the midst of a conversation where I feel myself becoming very emotionally upset, I guess, how do I step away until I'm in a space where I can talk about it calmly? And so it's not about, you know, people talk about how we have to control our emotions. And I think, frankly, trying to control our emotions sets us up for failure, because emotions are going to happen.
They're going to pop up later.
Our reactions. Absolutely.
Yeah. If we suppress it completely, then we're just incubating something that's
absolutely. Yeah. And that's what happens with those people who, when you ask them what's happened, everything pours out, is that there's been no outlet. And so it's, once those floodgates open, everything pours out. And so it's this dance of learning how to manage it, which is hard. It's something I teach this and I still continue to work on. You know, I yelled at my kids the other morning when they were up until 1:30 in the morning, and I yelled at them. I mean, we're human. The emotions get to be too much and it comes out.
But what success is, I think, in this regard, and I'm on the journey too, is shortening the time to notice, and recover, and come back with that calm, grounded, centered person. And one of the challenges of our work culture is that we're under pressure to do more with less. There may be increasing financial stresses now, and that pressure makes it harder to stay in that grounded, centered place. So I talk a lot too with leaders about having 2-minute practices of breathing, so you can you can center very quickly. So that can be a whole other discussion, but definitely have something that gets you in the place for conversations that you know you're going to have. And maybe is what would you recommend then, if you notice you're in a conversation and your emotion may be unchecked, or the person you're talking to may be, spiraling in a way that is not helpful?
So I think there's a few things. When it's us, I think we're entirely justified to say, I'm feeling a little worked up about this right now. It is important that we speak about this. Can we, I'd like to suggest that we speak about this, whenever you think you can handle it, later today, tomorrow. Set a limit around when you think how much time you need to be able to manage that situation. Now, it's important though that what people will often do is say, I can't talk about this right now, let's talk about it later. And of course, the other person then feels anxious that this is just going to disappear, because that's what often happens, right? It's a way to escape.
Okay,
and so
everybody,
you have to propose
this is really good relationship advice too. This is not just like workplace advice, that's relationship advice. It's, if you're going to defer something, you need to give an idea of when. Otherwise, you've just pushed someone away without an invitation to come back, and that's disconnecting.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. And so the person needs, and I listen, when you're trying to change these patterns, the other person probably is initially going to push. I've had my own experiences
Mhm.
where, I've said, listen, I'd like to have this conversation later, and the other person has insisted it be now. And you just have to stick to, kindly and firmly saying, I'm not in a position where I think I can have this conversation productively right now, and just stick
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah.
Now, when it's the other person, it's also setting that limit of, I feel right now that the way we're discussing this, we're not able to have a productive conversation. And I'd like to speak
Productive or
about this tomorrow.
respectful, or there's a lot of,
Absolutely.
maybe there's some words that you can agree on.
Yeah.
Just talking off my head here, but words that you can agree
Yeah.
on,
So
that
you want
the
to be
how you
careful.
communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. But you want to be careful not to blame, so you want to be careful to not say, you're yelling at me. I mean, you can say these things, but
Oh
it
yeah.
is going to put the other person on the defensive.
I
So
don't mean in
the
that
word is,
moment. I don't
yeah,
mean in that moment. I mean as a, you're going to set an agenda and some team norms about, this is how we're going to communicate. We're going to
yeah,
make sure we're being respectful. So you can point to that agenda and say, I don't think that I'm in a position to honor what we've agreed to
yes,
right now.
yes,
And so you're like, this is what we talked about, right? We understand that's what we're aiming for. I'm not able to do that right
yes,
now.
yeah, yeah,
And it might be that the other person's emotion is stressing you out so much, you might want to say, you're so upset we can't talk now, but it's, you know what,
yeah.
you don't, just talk about what you can do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the leader's role in all of that is to create that safe environment. So once the
Mm-hmm.
team has come up with those norms,
Mm.
so I like to set it up so that, sort of the way you've described, everyone in the room has ownership over, you know, ensuring that these conversations go respectfully and that the norms are followed. But if the team isn't doing that, the leader really does have the responsibility to say, hey, you know what, let's take a 5-minute break. Let's all go take a breath,
Yes.
because it is their role to create an environment where people feel safe sharing their concerns. And in my view, when you can create that environment, it's not just about people feeling safe. That's the core
Mm.
of it. But the reality is that when people don't feel safe in a meeting, they're not going to challenge thinking. They're not going to tell you that the decision you're making, they know something about that product and why that's going to cost you a ton of money,
Yeah.
because they're scared of the reaction, so
Yeah.
it ends up costing companies an awful lot of money to not create that kind of environment.
So I love this conversation. You're triggering a lot of thoughts here, and this is maybe a bit of a tangent, maybe not. I've been trying to do some research on the percentage of people that are comfortable speaking up about
Mm.
something that they see is not right. And we're seeing, I'm, so as we see the Black Lives Matter movement, for example,
Yeah.
there are a lot more people speaking up, I think, because it's people of all races are speaking up saying Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
Like there are pockets where it's clearly people are thinking it's still not safe to speak up. But overall, I think the conversation amplified this time because there's a collective support for it.
Right.
So that safe container matters if we're going to have more voices feel okay to not be liked by everybody, be a little bit
Mm.
uncomfortable that all eyes are on you when you're saying something,
Yeah.
being able to say something that may not be 100% right and not getting torn down for it. The
Yeah.
whole conversation online around masks right now, and should we wear them, should we not wear them? I have a pretty clear view on the kind thing to do for other people, but it's very, communication is very divisive,
Yeah.
and that safe container I see when there's safety, I see the voices coming up, and
Yes.
I want more of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because actually, as getting back to how stress relates into all of this, so I'm
Mm.
I'm somebody who, I've done a lot of work on communication and bringing myself back to that calm state where I can try to understand someone's perspective instead of tear them down for having it. And
Yeah.
as COVID hit, so this was in the early days when the debates were around whether we should social distance or not, I found myself online being very pointed in the way, somebody would say, for instance, oh, this is all just a hoax. And I would, be in there. The way I was communicating was not a way that people were going to reflect on what I was saying, because we
Mm.
were just polarizing in our views. And so I did that for maybe a week, and was all, had all my pent up frustration around it. And then I realized
It's exhausting.
it's
It's
exhausting,
exhausting.
and I'm affecting no change, because
Right.
the way I am communicating with
Right.
these people online is the way they're communicating with me, which is very reactive. And so nobody's listening. And that was my moment
There's a
of,
lot of blocking. They're not listening
yeah,
is like, there's a lot of just blocking, which is,
yeah,
yes, we have to set boundaries, but then the conversation is over. And
yes,
I like conversation. I like when I'm learning, and I want to stay open to learning, but the conversation norms about respect have to be there. They have to be in place.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and when we can shift, so from that, I took, a week or two off of social media almost entirely. I realized, okay, I need to calm myself down, deal with my own emotions about COVID, and come
Yeah.
back in a place where I can engage in this respectfully. And from there, I can now have those conversations in a way that uh, we're both considering the other person's point of view a bit better. And so at the core of it, I think, getting back to Black Lives Matter, I think getting ourselves to a space, being aware of how our emotions are feeding into sometimes communicating reactively, because either we feel that we've been blamed for something, or we're feeling insecure, or whatever it is. To me, that's one of the core skills of being able to really hear someone else's point of view, is noticing. So I try to notice, oh, I'm responding really defensively. Take a
Yeah.
step back. Why is that?
Yeah. So yeah, I say self-awareness is everything, right?
Yeah,
It's,
I agree.
it all starts there. So yeah, if I think that the opportunity is that if you walk away from a conversation and it's feeling like that did not go the way I intended it to, and it doesn't, or something doesn't feel good, stay there and
Yeah,
dance in it, dance in the
yeah,
discomfort to say, what happened? And what part did I play in it?
yes,
Right? Which is a
yeah,
brave question to ask, but stay there. That's part of the conversation. I would, think, extend it out to this assessment, this noticing afterwards of what happened there. What did I say to influence that outcome?
yeah. Yeah, I think you're hitting on two key things that I talk about a lot, being, staying, I say get comfortable feeling uncomfortable. And the more you do that, the more comfortable you start to feel in those situations. But
Yeah.
you push yourself into more situations where you feel uncomfortable. But that's
Yeah.
where change is going to happen.
Yeah.
And then the other piece just being that we often look at, especially when we're upset, right? When we've been hurt, when someone said something we don't like, when we don't feel heard, we immediately look at what the other person did, and we forget our contribution. And the
Mm-hmm.
reality is that we can't force anyone to change their behavior. And I spent years of my life wanting to change other people because they were the cause of this conflict. And then, after my parents died, I realized that I realized the part I was adding to the dynamics, and how I needed to shift my own way of communicating in order for those dynamics to change. And that's a big, like you said, it's a big step to accept responsibility for that. But gosh, it
Yeah.
frees you. So freeing.
Can I ask you a little bit about that
Yeah, of
then? Because
course.
that's a very sensitive time,
Yeah.
losing both your parents.
Hmm.
How did that deeply tragic situation, how did that influence this opportunity to shift the way where you were communicating? What was the connection to that?
Yeah, it was really profound, because what I realized, so my mom and uncle actually had died together in a car accident, and then my dad died 2 years later. And I would say
Oof.
the major realization started after the car accident, because I started, no, my energy was just flattened, just overnight flattened. I
Yeah.
went from working full time and whatever to not wanting to get out of bed for, I had to, because I had kids, thankfully. But so I noticed really quickly where my energy was draining, because I had none. And I
Mm-hmm.
started to notice that sometimes the phone would ring and I would run to it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I would ignore it again and again and again. And I started looking at what are the patterns that are leading to this automatic desire to communicate with the person or not. And it really was that in these conversations that tended to be reactive and tended to be negative, or when I felt not heard, those were the conversations I was avoiding.
Mm.
And so it really fed into me then watching the patterns in the workplace and how similar they are to kind of what I was experiencing, except maybe more subtle. I think it became blatant because of, you know, the depth of situation that I was in the moment. And over time, as I learned to put better boundaries around the types of conversations that I would listen to or engage in, for example, back to Black Lives Matter, I work with Indigenous populations quite frequently, and up until then would be a bystander to racially charged comments that made me feel highly uncomfortable, and mostly wouldn't speak up. And that takes your energy when you know it's wrong and you know you should be saying something. It's a heavy weight. And so I started noticing those things more, that you know, and learning how to communicate in ways that don't let my energy seep away.
So I appreciate this whole sharing that you just did with us. But that last piece there, noticing the weight of not saying something, you know, feeling not safe, right? That's that. Whoa. First of all, not feeling safe enough to say it, and then carrying the weight away. So as a leader, thinking about your people, if there are people on your team that want to say something, they're carrying an extra weight because of that lack of safety.
Yeah.
So,
well, and you're leading like a double life, right? Because in many ways, then I would go and face my clients knowing I'd heard these things, obviously not telling them about it, but it's this almost this dual life of I'll be this person with you to fit in, and I'll be this person with you to fit in. And at the core of it, it took a lot of energy. And so for me, it's been a process of, you know, trying to learn to be myself and say what I need to say, and that attracts the people who will let you be who you are. And I think as a leader, when you can bring that out in your team, when you can let them be who they are and respect them for their differences instead of unintentionally, I think, sometimes trying to fit them into a mold, that's where I think you get the best bang for your buck in terms of creativity and teamwork and performance and all of that, because the person's not carrying that weight with them all day.
That's incredibly powerful. The other thing that just came to mind is sometimes the person has a need and may be struggling to find the words to put to it, or to articulate it in a way that's going to resonate with you. So, and what I hearken back to here is when I was in the corporate world, and I found it when my kids were 3 and 5 incredibly exhausting to take them to daycare one way 20 minutes and to get downtown 50 minutes plus the other way and I was working 4 days a week. So, you know, I was lucky enough to have negotiated 4 days a week, but still to be in the office, for which I was on the phone 90% of the time, I found it really tough. And I tried a lot of different ways to have conversation about it, but I never had language around the fact that I'm a highly sensitive person, of which there are 15 to 20% of the population is. I didn't have that language. So
I'm there with you.
Right. So, and introverts working in open concept offices, exhausted. There's a weight, like you said, I call it a tax. Sometimes there's a tax of the environment that not everybody's equipped to deal with. And that comes back to that individual work experience opportunity that we have now. And what do you need to succeed? Well, I actually need quiet and I need daylight. So there were certain, you know, I remember when I started that job, I mean, the writing was kind of on the wall from the beginning. I was asked to sit in a cubicle outside my boss's office, and there was window like 50 feet in one direction. There were empty offices over there. And I said, you know, I'll be sitting over there until somebody needs that space. Okay. Because it was October, November, that time of year, going into the dark half. I'm like, I will not be successful sitting in this space. Like
Yeah.
but there was no opportunity to have that discussion. The leadership, it was interesting because I've got to learn a little bit more about the leadership perspective there, and valid thoughts. Absolutely. Leadership perspective was, I want you in the office for your leadership, Claire, with the other people. I want this mentorship. If we'd have had an open conversation, well, how do we accomplish that? It was a little bit unrealistic because I didn't really work with the people that were there anyway. But how do we accomplish that? We could have had a needs-based exploratory discussion. What are you saying, Claire? This woman I worked for, unfortunately, she didn't have any children, so her ability to understand my reality was also. I mean, we don't understand everybody else's reality, but the opportunity is to try and do that. Try and understand what the leader requires and wanted to see from me showing up in the office, and for the leader to have a conversation with me to understand, okay, so what is the real challenge here and what do you need? Never came up, right? So opportunity all around.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too, in there, is that it's necessary to trust and believe what the employee is saying. So I've seen scenarios where information is gathered from employees, but then people will say, well, I think she's just trying to take advantage of this situation because X, Y, Z. And I mean, are there people who take advantage? Certainly, but I think the vast majority of people are trying to make do and trying to do the best they can. And I think it's Brené Brown, if I'm not mistaken, who talks about how people are trying to do the best they can. And I think when you can approach the world from that angle, then it allows you to hear what they're saying. And like you say, do a needs-based analysis on, okay, this is what they are needing. This is what the organization is needing. Where can we find a fit for both? And how can we negotiate around the pieces that aren't a fit for both? To me, that's a much more productive way of keeping people engaged, because at the end of the day, I had a similar situation like you where I was downtown and then had kids, and they let me work from home initially. And then when I went on my second mat leave, changed their mind that it was going to be downtown again. And I left because
exactly.
The reality was that I didn't want to spend 3 hours in transportation. And so
I more
see that
time getting ready. Like the whole preparation, there's a lot that goes, and so it's an interesting one, right? Because there's a lot of science coming out, or studies coming out, talking about how many people want to go back to work, how many people want to stay working from home. And the couple with 5 children, I'm sure an office is heavenly at some moments to be able to go to an office, right? So there is no one way. And so conversation and opportunity to meet the needs, like you said, of the organization, of the team, of the need to collaborate. So I remember the job I had before that, where I ended up leaving the organization because of an inability to fit. I worked 3.5 days a week from home with a commitment that anytime they wanted me in the office, I would be there. Absolutely. Anytime. And that was on culture change. It was my favorite job in my whole career. So it's amazing. And I think it's a leadership opportunity to create that safe place and invite these kinds of conversations and not be afraid of them. Clearly, if there are issues, they will surface, and there are protocols to deal with the issues, but not to go in thinking, how many issues am I going to have today?
I think you have less issues if you, so I think companies who are looking at, in terms of the return to work, are looking at, are we bringing people back to the office or are we not? Again, that's maybe a bit misguided, because I don't know if it needs to be an all or nothing conversation. Like you said, I think some people want to be back in the office and are more productive there, and I think some are not. And then, like you said, through that process, you're going to identify who is in a situation that's not actually a good fit for them. And then those situations can be addressed one-on-one versus for the team as a whole. And I think those are the companies who are going to really thrive moving forward, because they'll have everyone at their best.
Yeah, I think there's an onboarding discussion to have that talks about preferences based on practical considerations and temperament. And, there's a whole kind of slice of humanity that's been missing from how we hire, and then how we ongoing keep people engaged, because life changes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
that's a good point, right? Because the needs, when I look at my needs for, working from home or in the office, that has shifted drastically over my life cycle.
exactly.
And so even the same person's needs may not be the same throughout their career with the same company if they're there long term.
Exactly. And the crux of this is having great communication skills as a leader to navigate all of this. So without
Yeah.
the communication skills, this stuff doesn't get off the ground. I mean, we
Yeah.
could have some good processes and templates and steps to take, but to keep it going, conversation, one-on-one conversation is going to be
Yeah.
key
Yeah.
as a
I
leader.
think the processes need to be built off of the communications. Where I've seen organizations get off track a bit is they build the processes and then they fit the people into the processes.
Mhm.
And that, I mean, that works if you hire for a certain personality fit, but that's not the reality of
Mhm.
what happens unless you have a very tiny organization. I think having the conversations and then not fully molding the processes around the people, but creating the processes after you've gathered the information you need to understand the impacts of those decisions
Mm.
is gets you a better fit.
I think so. That's the opportunity for what I call sustainable performance, right?
Right.
You create that environment that people are happy to be
Yeah.
working in. And then if things change, they're also feeling it's safe to have a conversation about what's changed and
Yeah.
how do we navigate this going forward, which requires a whole fundamentally different shift in the relationship of work. I mean, as we've shifted
Yeah.
away from 40-year careers with one company, it's become much more transient. People are job flipping every 2-3 years, maybe. And so the
Mm.
relationship, the opportunity, that long-term thinking that can really breed some care for each other and commitment, it's a radical shift from what's going on in the workplace today.
Right. Well, and when you say that, I hadn't really reflected on how much that influences um, the humanity side or the people management side of things. But it's very true that the leaders or companies, let's say, have less incentive maybe to invest that time in their people, knowing that they may not stay as long. But I think the reality is that it's whether or not you decide to invest that time in your people that is a big factor in whether or not they stay, because there are still organizations who
Yeah.
are able to retain people, and there's big variations across companies and industries. So I think putting in place those practices, trusting that if
Yeah.
put people first,
Yeah.
that it's going to increase engagement and performance and keep people around longer is key.
Yeah, I think that one of the quotes I keep hearing is that people don't leave a company, they leave a leader they can't work for
Yeah.
anymore. So,
Yeah.
so it is, an employee retention strategy. It's engagement is one thing, but you want to keep your strong players. Well, COVID, if it's asking anything of us, it's asking for patience in whether
Yeah.
we're grocery shopping, whatever we're doing. It's more resource intensive than it has been. Space for sure, time, finances. And so if we can mindset shift to understand and commit to, I have to nurture the relationships here. What does that look like? What do I as a leader want to do differently now that I understand this is a key to actually succeeding and accomplishing the things I want, because greater value alignment will be there. That that
Yeah.
that feeling of wanting to support each other comes out of this kind of healthy, supportive, safe space. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
it's definitely worth spending some time on. Uh,
Yeah.
Now that was wonderful. I've got all kinds of notes here of key points we've talked about. Um, I'm just looking to see if I've missed anything. I don't think so. I think we covered everything that I wanted. Is there anything that you think that you want a leader to take away now, as that we haven't covered right now?
I think leaders are in a really privileged position to make this shift in not only in their companies, but in society, because a lot of what pulled me to this work was wanting to see this change in the world beyond just in organizations. And I think
Mhm.
although individuals can influence this type of change, I mean, we are seeing this in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think leaders are in a particular position because they're in a position of authority, and whether we like it or not, there is a dynamic where um, people are a bit uneasy sometimes, shifting the patterns in the team if they're not in a leadership position. So my biggest message to leaders is that they're in a position where they can change these dynamics, where they can create an environment where their team feels seen and heard for who they are. And that's a huge shift in the world. And I just think it's so important to step into that leadership position fully in a way that allows people to be seen for who they are. And so if these skills feel uncomfortable to you, and I know they probably do if it's not something you're used to doing, they can be learned. I've seen people say, for instance, empathy can't be learned, and I disagree. I've seen it learned. It's not a straight path.
It's not watch this video and you've got it. There's practice. There's practice and there's failure and there's trying it again, right? Yeah.
And there's moments in my life where I think, oh my gosh, if I had paparazzi following me and they had just caught that meltdown moment of mine and it went on the internet, people would be thinking, what does she do for work? Doesn't she teach about communication? Like, we're human, right? So it's not a straight path, and it will never be. And it's not about being that perfect leader who always communicates perfectly with their team. Like you said, it's about noticing the moments when it didn't go quite as we wanted, and being humble enough to admit our errors and our faults, and just keeping working on it. Like, to me, that is the key to a successful leader, is striving to always be better while also accepting that we have faults and we're human.
Yeah. And it's interesting, right? Because leaders, we don't see a lot of apologizing for mistakes. That's just not part of what we always, we have to have this is an inability for leaders to make mistakes. I remember Kathleen Wynne in the last campaign, sorry, not sorry was the hashtag. And I'm like, no, baby, you needed to just stop at sorry. Like, it just needed to be sorry, because you just alienated a whole slew of people in the population with this inability to just be, I made a mistake. Right. And we all make mistakes. Now, some are much more significant than others, but in our learning journeys, we have to be able to make mistakes, and modeling that to your people is part of creating that safe space. So it might be interesting to think about, what mistake have you made recently that you could talk about? Right. I as a productivity organization professional, I did a very big blog post on my last website, which I have to reinvigorate, about how I lost my car. I didn't lose my car, but I thought I had lost, the keys got stolen. So I changed all the locks in the house. I had ordered a rental car and was out shopping for a new car before I realized where I left my car. So that's the short version. But yeah, highly embarrassing. My son won't let me forget it. But yeah, we have to be, it happens. But the interesting thing is, what happened there and what can I learn from it? What do I learn from it so that I can bring something forward into the way I want to be going forward?
Well, and if you think from a leadership perspective, you or anyone being able to share their missteps is what will make your team feel safe to come to you and say, hey, listen, I messed up. So I think back when I was a speech therapist, I ran a clinic. And one of the girls had to announce to one of the therapists had to announce to a parent that she wanted the child to be assessed for autism. She was a brand new graduate and felt very awkward doing it. So I coached her on it. And I got a phone call a week later from her telling me that she had avoided the conversation with the family and instead just gave them the report. So the family learned by reading these papers that she thought their child had autism. Not a good situation. But she phoned me to tell me of her error right off. And I think she did it because she knew that, although I held her accountable for her misstep, she knew I wasn't going to ream into her about being a terrible person. She knew that this behavior needed to change moving forward if she wanted to stay with the organization. But I think, without knowing that, I had modeled that to her, right? Of not being perfect.
I feel the weight of what she was carrying before she told you.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So
to
how,
keep
yeah,
in that sort of secretive, you don't want your employees hiding behind your back. You want them
yeah,
to be able to come to you and say, you know what, I really messed up. This is what I did with a client or a customer, and I'm
yeah,
sorry, or I missed this deadline. You don't want that hiding from you, because
yeah,
that's going to snowball into much bigger problems. So I think modeling being human and making mistakes gives your employees an authorization, almost like they have a permission slip that they can be real with you when they've messed up.
yeah. I'd love to challenge every leader who's listening to this to come up with a failure story that you're going to use with your people, that you're comfortable, and you may practice sharing it and getting more comfortable. And what did you learn from it? So what might you share? That might be a really interesting takeaway from this conversation. Lindsay, boy,
Wonderful.
I've loved. Obviously, you triggered a lot of thoughts, things that happened to me, and I hope you've done the same for everyone who's listening. Where can people find out more about how to work with you, Lindsay?
Yeah, so my website is lindsaylapaquette.com, and you can find all my information there on my coaching and speaking and consulting.
Okay, so Lindsay with an A.
Yes,
Yes.
Lindsay, and the last name's
Okay.
Lapaquette.com.
Awesome. Awesome. When I edit this, I'll throw that up on screen as well. But for anybody listening right now, that's how to find Lindsay. And you've heard a lot of words of wisdom. So it's an opportunity for leaders here to lighten the load for your team, so that they're
For
able to,
yourself.
yeah, yes, for yourself as
Yeah.
well, so that you can keep performing and keep enjoying what you're doing. So
Yeah.
I want to wish you, Lindsay, a fabulous rest of this beautiful summer day. And to everyone
Thank
who's
you.
listening, whether it's now live or later on, thank you for joining this Work From Home Better interview. Again, it was Lindsay Lapaquette from lindsaylapaquette.com, a workplace communications expert. Stay tuned for more Work From Home Better interviews, which you can find on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Clare Kumar. So there's a whole series there for you to dig into. And of course, I've built an online program, and I'm doing some support for organizations who want to work better from home, both for leaders and their teams. So reach out to me if you want to know any more about that. All right, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me. What a privilege it was to
Thank
spend
you.
time with you.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Claire.